James Miller was only 23 years old when his entire world fell apart. It was a cold Tuesday morning when he got the news that his father had passed away suddenly. The funeral was small, just family and a few neighbors from their farm. James thought the hardest part was over, but he was wrong. The real nightmare began 3 days after they buried his father. A man showed up at their door. His name was Robert Thornton, and he owned most of the land in their county. James had seen him around town before, always dressed in expensive suits and riding in a fancy car. Robert didn't waste any time with pleasantries. He pulled out a stack of papers and laid them on their kitchen table. "Your father owed me $50,000, Robert said, tapping the papers with his thick finger. "The loan was due last month. Now that he's gone, this debt falls on you." James felt his stomach drop. $50,000. They didn't have $50 to spare, let alone $50,000. His mother started crying quietly in the corner. Their small farm barely made enough money to feed them. There was no way they could pay back such a huge amount. "We don't have that kind of money," James said, his voice shaking. "You know we don't." Robert smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "Then I'll take the farm. You have 30 days to vacate the property." For 3 days, James didn't sleep. He tried everything. He went to the bank, but they laughed when he asked for a loan. He tried to sell some of their equipment, but it was too old and broken. Nobody wanted it. He watched his mother cry herself to sleep every night, and he felt completely helpless. Their family had owned this farm for 3 generations. Now they were going to lose everything. On the 4th day, his mother called him into the living room. She looked like she hadn't slept either. Her eyes were red and puffy from crying. "There might be a way," she said quietly. "Robert came back yesterday while you were in town. He made an offer." James sat down, his heart pounding. "What kind of offer?" His mother took a deep breath. "He said he would forgive the entire debt. We could keep the farm. Everything would be cleared." "That doesn't make sense," James said. "Why would he do that?" "There's a condition," his mother whispered. "He wants you to marry someone." James laughed, but it came out bitter and harsh. "Marry who? His daughter? Is this some kind of joke?" "Not his daughter," his mother said. She looked down at her hands. Catherine Blackwood. The name hit James like a punch to the gut. Everyone in 3 counties knew that name. Catherine Blackwood, the Black Widow of Silver Creek. People crossed the street when they saw her coming. Mothers used her name to scare their children into behaving. There were so many stories about her that James didn't know what was true and what was just gossip. What he did know was this. Catherine had been married once before, and her husband had died under mysterious circumstances. After that, 3 different men had tried to court her. All 3 of them died within months. One fell off his horse and broke his neck. Another got sick with fever and never recovered. The 3rd one drowned in the river, even though he was a strong swimmer. People said she was cursed. Some said she was a witch. Others whispered that she poisoned her victims. Nobody knew for sure, but everyone agreed on one thing. Stay away from Catherine Blackwood if you wanted to live. "You can't be serious," James said. "You want me to marry her? The woman everyone calls the Black Widow? I don't want this," his mother cried. "But what choice do we have? If we don't accept, we lose everything. We'll be homeless, James. I'm too old to start over. And you? You're so young. You deserve better than this." James spent the next 3 days thinking. He barely ate. He walked around their farm, looking at everything his father and grandfather had built. The old barn where he'd learned to ride a horse. The fields where he'd worked every summer since he was 8 years old. The house where he'd grown up, where all his memories lived. He thought about his mother, who had already lost her husband. Could he really let her lose her home too? Could he watch her end up on the streets with nothing? But he also thought about Catherine Blackwood. He'd only seen her a few times in town, always from a distance. She was tall and always wore black dresses. She never smiled, never talked to anyone. People said she lived alone in a big ranch house on the edge of town, with just a few ranch hands who were too desperate for work to be afraid of her reputation. On the 7th day, Robert Thornton came back. "Well?" he asked. "What's your answer?" James looked at his mother, then at the farm around them. He thought about his father, who had worked himself to death trying to keep this place running. He thought about all the generations of Millers who had lived on this land. "I'll do it," James said. The words felt like stones in his mouth. "I'll marry her." Robert smiled that cold smile again. Smart choice, boy. The wedding will be in 2 weeks. Don't even think about running. If you do, the deal is off and I'll take everything you own. After Robert left, James's mother hugged him tight, crying into his shoulder. I'm so sorry, she kept saying. I'm so sorry. James didn't cry. He felt too numb for tears. He just kept thinking about what he'd agreed to do. In 2 weeks, he would marry a woman he'd never even spoken to. A woman everyone said was dangerous. A woman who might be a murderer. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur. James tried to prepare himself. But how do you prepare for something like this? He lay awake at night, wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake. Wondering if he would become the fourth man to die after getting involved with Catherine Blackwood. His friends came by to say goodbye, treating him like he was going off to war. Some of them told him he was crazy. Others said he was brave. One of his oldest friends pulled him aside and said, "Just be careful, James. Watch what you eat and drink. Don't trust her." The day before the wedding, James rode out to the edge of town and looked at Catherine's ranch from a distance. It was a huge property, much bigger than his family's small farm, but even from far away he could see that it looked lonely. There were no lights in the windows, no smoke from the chimney, just a big dark house sitting alone on the hill. James wondered what kind of woman lived in that house. Was she really as dangerous as everyone said? Or were the stories just that, stories? He didn't know, and that scared him more than anything. That night, James couldn't sleep at all. He kept thinking about the morning, when he would get dressed in his father's old suit and go to marry a stranger. A stranger who might be his doom. He thought about running away. He could saddle his horse right now and ride until he was far from this town. Far from Catherine Blackwood, far from all of this. But then he thought about his mother, and he knew he couldn't do it. He'd made a promise. As the sun started to rise on his wedding day, James got out of bed. His hands were shaking as he got dressed. He looked at himself in the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. He looked pale and scared, like a man walking to his own funeral. "God help me," James whispered to his reflection. "I hope I survive this." The morning of the wedding was gray and cold. Dark clouds hung low in the sky, and a bitter wind cut through James's coat as he rode toward Catherine's ranch. His mother rode beside him in their old wagon, crying softly. Neither of them spoke much. What was there to say? As they got closer to the property, James felt his heart beating faster and faster. The ranch was even bigger up close than it had looked from a distance. There were several barns, a large stable, and endless fields stretching out in every direction. But everything looked sad somehow. The paint on the buildings was peeling. Weeds grew tall around the fences. It was like the whole place had given up on being beautiful. The house itself stood at the center of it all, 3 stories tall with large windows that stared out like empty eyes. James noticed that most of the curtains were drawn shut, making the house look even more unwelcoming. A few ranch hands were working near one of the barns, but they kept their heads down, not making eye contact as James and his mother passed by. Robert Thornton was waiting at the front steps, still wearing that cold smile of his. "Right on time," he said. "Catherine is waiting inside." James climbed down from his horse, his legs feeling weak. He helped his mother down from the wagon, and together they walked up the steps. The front door was already open, leading into a dark hallway. James took a deep breath and stepped inside. The inside of the house was just as cold as the outside. The furniture looked expensive but old, like it hadn't been moved or cleaned in years. Dust covered most surfaces. The walls were bare except for a few old paintings in heavy frames. There were no flowers, no photographs, nothing that made the place feel like a home. It felt more like a museum or a tomb. They walked through the hallway into a large room at the back of the house. About 20 people were already there, standing in small groups and speaking in hushed whispers. James recognized some of them from town. They all stopped talking when he entered, turning to stare at him with a mixture of pity and curiosity. He felt like an animal in a cage. At the far end of the room, standing alone by a window, was Catherine. This was the first time James had seen her up close, and he was struck by how different she looked from what he'd imagined. She was tall, yes, but not in a frightening way. She wore a simple black dress that reached the floor. Her dark hair was pulled back tightly from her face, but it was her eyes that caught his attention. They were gray like storm clouds, and they seemed to look right through him. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. Her face was completely blank, showing no emotion at all. It was like looking at a statue of a woman rather than a real person. A minister stood near her, holding a worn Bible. He looked nervous, his hands shaking slightly as he gestured for James to come forward. James felt his mother squeeze his hand once, then let go. He walked alone across the room, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Everyone watched him. Nobody spoke. When he reached Catherine's side, she didn't look at him. She kept staring straight ahead, her hands folded in front of her. James could feel the cold radiating from her. Or maybe it was just the coldness of the room. He couldn't tell. The minister cleared his throat and began the ceremony. His voice shook as he spoke, rushing through the words like he wanted to get this over with as quickly as possible. James barely heard what the man was saying. His mind was racing, his heart pounding so hard he thought everyone must be able to hear it. "Do you, James Miller, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" the minister asked. James's mouth was dry. He swallowed hard and managed to whisper, "I do." The minister turned to Catherine. "And do you, Catherine Blackwood, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" For a moment, nothing happened. The silence stretched out, heavy and suffocating. James wondered if she was going to refuse, if this whole thing had been some kind of cruel joke. Then Catherine spoke, her voice low and flat. "I accept this arrangement. Not I do. Not I will." Just those 4 cold words. "I accept this arrangement." She said it like she was agreeing to a business deal, not a marriage. James felt something sink in his chest. The minister quickly finished the ceremony. "You may kiss the bride," he said. But his voice was so quiet it was almost a whisper. James turned to Catherine. She finally looked at him then, her gray eyes meeting his for the first time. There was nothing in those eyes. No warmth, no anger, no fear, nothing. She didn't lean toward him. She didn't move at all. After a moment of awkward silence, James leaned in and gave her the briefest, most formal kiss on the cheek. Her skin was cold. "Congratulations," the minister said weakly, closing his Bible with a snap. Nobody else said anything. Robert Thornton stepped forward, pulling out some papers from his coat. "Sign here," he told James, pointing to a line at the bottom of a document. "This confirms the marriage and the cancellation of your family's debt." James signed with a shaking hand. Catherine signed too, her signature neat and precise. Just like that, it was done. James was married to the Black Widow of Silver Creek. The guests filed out quickly after that, clearly eager to leave. They made excuses about work or dinner, barely looking at James or Catherine as they hurried toward the door. His mother came over and hugged him tight, crying into his shoulder. "Be careful," she whispered. "Please be careful." "I will, Mama," James said, though he had no idea how to be careful in a situation like this. After she left, only James and Catherine remained in the big empty room. The silence was deafening. James didn't know what to say or do. Should he talk to her? Should he wait for her to speak first? Every story he'd ever heard about her ran through his mind, making his stomach twist with anxiety. Finally, Catherine moved. She walked past him without a word, her black dress rustling softly. James followed her through the house, down a long hallway lined with closed doors. She stopped at one of the doors and pushed it open. "This is your room," she said. Her voice was flat, emotionless. James looked inside. It was a simple bedroom with a bed, a dresser, and a small window. It was clean but plain, like a room in a boarding house. "Stay out of my way and you'll survive," Catherine said. She was looking at him now, her gray eyes hard as steel. "I don't need a husband. I don't want a husband. This arrangement serves a purpose for both of us. Keep to yourself, do your work, and we'll have no problems. Do you understand?" James nodded, not trusting his voice. "Good," Catherine said. She turned to leave, then paused. "My room is at the end of the hall. Don't ever come there. The ranch hands will show you what work needs to be done in the morning. Dinner is at 6. Be on time." Then she was gone, disappearing down the hallway like a shadow. James heard a door close somewhere in the distance, and then there was only silence. He stepped into his room and closed the door behind him. The reality of what had just happened hit him all at once. He was married. He was living in this cold, dark house with a woman everyone said was dangerous. A woman who had just told him to stay out of her way if he wanted to survive. James sat on the bed and put his head in his hands. He thought about his farm, about his mother, about his father who had died and started all of this. He thought about the debt that was now paid, the price he'd agreed to pay. That night, James barely slept. Every sound in the old house made him jump. He heard footsteps in the hallway at one point and tensed, wondering if Catherine was coming to his door. But the footsteps passed by and faded away. He lay awake in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, wondering what his life had become. He was married to a stranger, living in a house that felt more like a prison, tied to a woman who looked at him with eyes as cold as ice. James thought about those 4 words Catherine had spoken during the ceremony. I accept this arrangement. Not a marriage. An arrangement. That's all this was to her. That's all he was to her. As the first light of dawn began to creep through his window, James made a promise to himself. He would survive this. He would stay out of Catherine's way, do his work, and keep his head down. He would live through this arrangement no matter what it took. But deep down, in a place he didn't want to acknowledge, James couldn't help wondering, how long would it be before he became the 4th man to die after getting involved with Catherine Blackwood? The first week at Catherine's ranch felt like the longest week of James's life. He woke up every morning before the sun rose, just like he had back on his family's farm. But this place was different. Everything here was bigger, colder, and somehow sadder. True to her word, Catherine showed him what work needed to be done. She took him around the property that first morning, pointing out the different barns and fields. She spoke in short, clipped sentences, giving him instructions without any warmth or kindness. It was like listening to a boss, not a wife. The horses need feeding at dawn, she said, pointing to the stable. The fences in the north field need repairing. The cattle need to be moved to the east pasture by the end of the week. James nodded, taking mental notes of everything. He expected her to leave after giving him the tour, but she didn't. Instead, she grabbed a pair of work gloves and started working alongside him. This surprised him. He'd assumed she would stay in the house, maybe give orders from a distance like rich landowners usually did. But Catherine worked harder than anyone he'd ever seen. She was up before dawn every single day, already dressed and working by the time James made it outside. She repaired fences, fed animals, hauled supplies, and did all the heavy work that most women wouldn't even attempt. Her hands were rough and calloused, not soft like you'd expect from someone who owned such a big ranch. The ranch hands, 3 older men who'd worked there for years, barely spoke to her. They did their jobs and kept their distance, just like she'd told James to do. During lunch breaks, they would sit together under a tree and eat, talking quietly among themselves. Catherine always ate alone, sitting on the porch steps of the house, staring out at nothing. James tried to keep his distance like she'd asked, but it was hard not to watch her. She was like a mystery he couldn't figure out. During the day, she was all business, never showing any emotion. She didn't smile, didn't laugh, didn't even seem to get angry when things went wrong. She just fixed problems with a cold efficiency that was almost frightening. But James started noticing small things that didn't match the stories people told about her. One morning, he saw a stray dog limping around near the barn. It was thin and dirty, clearly abandoned or lost. James expected Catherine to chase it away, maybe even shoot it like some ranchers did with strays. Instead, she stopped what she was doing and knelt down. She spoke softly to the dog, so quietly James couldn't hear what she was saying. Then she went into the house and came back with food and water. She set it down for the dog and walked away. But James noticed she kept glancing back to make sure it was eating. Another time, he found her in the barn late at night. He'd forgotten his jacket and had come back to get it. Through the open barn door, he could see Catherine sitting in the hay, holding a tiny kitten. One of the barn cats had given birth a week earlier, and this kitten was the smallest of the litter. Catherine was bottle feeding it, her movements gentle and careful. When she noticed James watching, her face immediately went cold again. She put the kitten down and walked past him without a word. Then there was the thunderstorm. It came on suddenly one afternoon, with lightning that cracked the sky and thunder that shook the ground. James was running toward the house when he saw Catherine standing frozen near the stable, her face pale as a ghost. Her whole body was shaking and her hands were pressed against her ears. She looked terrified, like a child afraid of the dark. "Catherine," James called out, but she didn't seem to hear him. He ran over and gently touched her arm. She flinched and spun around, her eyes wide and wild. For just a moment he saw real emotion there, raw fear and something that looked like pain. Then just as quickly she pulled herself together. She yanked her arm away from him and ran into the house, leaving James standing in the rain, confused and concerned. Dinners were the strangest time of all. Every evening at 6 o'clock sharp, Catherine would ring a bell. James would go to the dining room, where a simple meal would be laid out on the long table. Catherine would sit at one end, James at the other, with at least 10 feet of empty space between them. They would eat in complete silence, the only sound the clinking of forks on plates. James tried to start conversations a few times. "The fence repair went well today," he'd say, or, "The weather's supposed to be nice tomorrow." But Catherine would just nod or give a one-word response, never looking up from her plate. After a while he stopped trying, but he kept watching. He couldn't help it. He started to see patterns in her behavior. She never ate much, just picked at her food. She always kept her back to the wall like she was afraid someone might sneak up on her. And sometimes, when she thought no one was looking, her hand would drift to a small locket she wore around her neck. She'd touch it briefly, and her face would soften just a little before she caught herself, and that cold mask would return. One Sunday afternoon, James was in the house looking for a tool he'd left somewhere. Most of the rooms were closed off, but one door was slightly open. He glanced inside and saw it was a study or library of some kind. There were books lining the walls and a large desk by the window. On the desk, James noticed a photograph in a frame. He knew he shouldn't look. Knew it was probably crossing the line Catherine had drawn. But curiosity got the better of him. He stepped into the room and picked up the photograph. It showed a younger Catherine, maybe in her early 20s. She was smiling, actually smiling, her face full of life and joy. Next to her was a young man with his arm around her shoulders, also smiling. They looked happy. They looked in love. "What are you doing in here?" James jumped and spun around. Catherine stood in the doorway, her face like thunder. He quickly put the photograph down, his heart racing. "I'm sorry, I was just looking for a tool and I saw—" "Get out," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "I told you to stay out of my way." "Catherine, I didn't mean to." "Get out." James left quickly, his face burning with embarrassment. He'd crossed a line and he knew it. But he couldn't stop thinking about that photograph. The Catherine in that picture looked like a completely different person. What had happened to change her so much? That night, James worked up the courage to ask one of the ranch hands about it. The old man, whose name was Frank, looked uncomfortable with the question. "Best not to ask about the past, son," Frank said, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "That's her business, not ours." "But the stories people tell," James pressed. "About her husband dying, about the other men. What really happened?" Frank was quiet for a long moment. Finally he sighed. "Her first husband, Daniel, he was killed about 7 years ago. Rustlers hit the ranch one night. Daniel went out to stop them and they shot him dead. Catherine found him lying in the dirt, already gone. She was never the same after that." "And the other men?" James asked. Frank shrugged. "Bad luck, mostly. Tom fell off his horse because he was drunk. Henry caught fever, probably from drinking bad water. And poor Billy, he went swimming in the river during spring flooding, which any fool knows is dangerous. But people love a good story, and the truth isn't as interesting as calling her a black widow." James felt something shift in his understanding. These weren't mysterious deaths. They were accidents, tragedies that had nothing to do with Catherine. But people had blamed her anyway, probably because she was a woman with land and money, things that made some folks uncomfortable. Over the next few weeks, James kept watching Catherine, but now he was looking for something different. He wasn't looking for signs of danger or evil. He was looking for signs of the woman in that photograph, the one who had smiled and looked happy, and slowly, very slowly, he started to see glimpses of her, like the way she hummed quietly to herself sometimes when she thought no one could hear, or how she would stop and watch the sunset just for a moment, before remembering herself and getting back to work, or how she kept a small garden behind the house that she tended with careful attention, growing flowers that no one ever saw. James began to understand that Catherine wasn't scary or dangerous. She was hurt. She was broken. She'd built walls around herself so high and so thick that she'd become a prisoner in her own life. People had made up stories about her, feared her, avoided her, and she'd learned to use that fear to keep everyone away. But why? Why live like this, so alone and isolated? One evening, as they sat at opposite ends of the dinner table in their usual silence, James finally understood. Catherine wasn't keeping people away because she was evil or cursed. She was keeping them away because she was terrified. Terrified of caring about someone again. Terrified of losing someone again. terrified of the pain that comes with letting people into your heart. The Black Widow of Silver Creek wasn't a monster. She was just a woman who had loved deeply, lost everything, and decided that being alone was safer than ever feeling that pain again. As James looked at her across the long table, picking at her food and staring at nothing, he felt something unexpected. Not fear, not pity, something else. Something that felt almost like understanding or maybe compassion. He didn't know it yet, but in that moment something had changed. Catherine wasn't just the stranger he'd been forced to marry anymore. She was a real person, with real pain, hiding behind a mask she'd worn for so long she'd almost forgotten how to take it off. And for the first time since arriving at this cold. 3 months had passed since the wedding. James had settled into a routine at the ranch, and while things weren't exactly comfortable, they weren't terrible either. He and Catherine still barely spoke, still ate in silence, still lived like two strangers under the same roof. But James had stopped being afraid of her. He'd started to see past the cold exterior to the sad, lonely woman underneath. The night everything changed started like any other night. James had finished his work and was cleaning up in the barn when Frank came running in, his face pale and worried. "We got a problem," Frank said, breathing hard. "I was checking the north fence and I saw riders. At least 4 or 5 of them, maybe more. They're cutting the fence line." James felt his blood run cold. Rustlers. Every rancher's nightmare. They'd steal cattle, horses, anything valuable they could get their hands on. And they were dangerous. Men who made their living stealing didn't hesitate to hurt anyone who got in their way. "Where's Catherine?" James asked. "She's in the house." "But listen, son. The smart thing to do is lock the doors and wait for them to take what they want and leave. Don't be a hero. It ain't worth dying over some cows." But James was already running toward the house. He burst through the kitchen door and found Catherine at the sink, washing dishes. She turned, startled by his sudden entrance. "Rustlers," James said, breathing hard. "North fence. Frank says there's at least 4 or 5 of them." For just a second, fear flashed across Catherine's face. Then it was gone, replaced by that cold mask she always wore. She dried her hands on a towel and walked past him to a cabinet. She pulled out a rifle and started loading it with steady hands. "Stay inside," she said. "Lock the doors after I leave." "What?" "No, you can't go out there alone." "This is my ranch," Catherine said, checking the rifle. "My responsibility." "Then I'm coming with you." "No," she said firmly. "You don't know how to handle situations like this. You'll just get in the way." But James grabbed another rifle from the cabinet. "I'm coming," he said, and his voice left no room for argument. Catherine looked at him for a long moment, her gray eyes searching his face. Then she nodded once and headed for the door. They ran across the dark yard toward the north field. James could see lights in the distance, torches or lanterns the rustlers were using. His heart was pounding so hard he thought it might burst out of his chest. He'd never been in a situation like this before. His hands were shaking as he held the rifle. As they got closer, James could make out the shapes of men and horses. They were loading cattle into a makeshift pen, working quickly. One of them noticed Catherine and James approaching and shouted a warning to the others. "That's far enough," Catherine yelled, raising her rifle. Her voice was strong and clear, showing no fear at all. "You're on private property. Leave now and we won't have trouble." The men laughed. There were 6 of them, James counted, all armed. One of them, a tall man with a thick beard, stepped forward. "Well, well," he said. "If it ain't the Black Widow herself. We were hoping you'd be tucked up in bed by now. Would have made this a lot easier." "I said leave," Catherine repeated. "Take your hands off my cattle and go. Or what?" The bearded man said. "You gonna shoot all 6 of us?" "I don't think so, lady. Now why don't you just go back to your house and let us finish our work here?" Catherine didn't move. She kept the rifle aimed straight at him. "This is your last warning." The bearded man's smile faded. "Boys," he said, "I think the widow needs to be taught some manners." The rustlers started to spread out, trying to surround them. James's heart was racing. This was bad. They were outnumbered 3 to 1. But then he glanced at Catherine and saw something that shocked him. Her hands were shaking. Just slightly, but definitely shaking. Her face had gone pale and her breathing was getting faster. She was trying to look brave, but James could see she was terrified. And suddenly he understood. This wasn't just about rustlers stealing cattle. This was about her husband, Daniel, who'd been killed by rustlers 7 years ago. This was her nightmare coming back to life. As the rustlers moved closer, Catherine's rifle wavered. Her hands were shaking harder now. One of the men noticed it too. "She's scared," he said with a nasty laugh. "Look at her, she's about to drop that gun." The bearded man took another step forward. Catherine raised the rifle, but James could see she was frozen. Her eyes were wide, her face white as a sheet. She was having some kind of panic attack, trapped in a memory of the night her husband died. Time seemed to slow down. James saw the bearded man reach for his own gun. He saw Catherine standing there, frozen and helpless. And without thinking, without planning, James moved. He stepped in front of Catherine, putting himself between her and the rustlers. "You want to get to her, you go through me first," he said. His voice was shaking, but he meant every word. The bearded man pulled his gun and fired. James felt something like a punch in his left shoulder, spinning him around. Pain exploded through his body, hot and sharp. He stumbled and fell to his knees. Behind him, he heard Catherine scream. It was a sound of pure terror and anguish, the first real emotion he'd heard from her in 3 months. Then he heard gunshots, lots of them. Catherine was firing the rifle, and she wasn't missing. The rustlers scrambled for cover, shouting and cursing. More gunshots rang out from a different direction. Frank and the other ranch hands had heard the commotion and come running. Caught between two groups of shooters, the rustlers gave up. They jumped on their horses and rode off into the darkness, leaving their torches and stolen cattle behind. James was lying on the ground now, clutching his shoulder. Blood was seeping between his fingers, warm and sticky. The pain was incredible, worse than anything he'd ever felt. He heard footsteps running toward him, and then Catherine was there, dropping to her knees beside him. "James," she gasped. "James, oh God, no, please no." Her hands were all over him, checking the wound. Her face was right above his, and what he saw there shocked him more than being shot. Her eyes were filled with tears streaming down her face. Her hands were shaking as she pressed them against his shoulder, trying to stop the bleeding. She was crying, actually crying, something he'd never seen her do. "You're okay," she kept saying, over and over like a prayer. "You're okay, you're going to be okay, please be okay." "Catherine," James managed to say through the pain. I'm fine. You stepped in front of me," she sobbed. "Why did you do that? You could have been killed. You stupid, stupid man, why did you do that?" "Because," James said. And even through the pain, he managed a small smile. "You're my wife." Something broke in Catherine then. She bent forward, her forehead touching his chest, and she cried. Really cried. All the tears she'd been holding back for 7 years came pouring out. Her whole body shook with sobs as she held onto him, her tears mixing with his blood on his shirt. Frank came running over with the other hands. "We need to get him to the house," he said. "That bullet needs to come out." They carried James inside and laid him on the kitchen table. Catherine never left his side. She held his hand while Frank cut away his shirt and examined the wound. She wiped the sweat from his face when the pain got bad. She talked to him, her voice soft and desperate, begging him to stay with her. "The bullet went clean through," Frank said finally. "He's lucky. Real lucky. We just need to clean it and bandage it up. He'll be fine." The relief on Catherine's face was overwhelming. She squeezed James's hand so hard it hurt almost as much as his shoulder. As Frank cleaned and bandaged the wound, Catherine stayed right there, holding his hand, not letting go. Later, after the wound was dressed and James was moved to his bed, Catherine sat in a chair beside him. The sun was starting to come up, painting the sky with pink and orange light. Her eyes were red and swollen from crying. Her hands were still shaking slightly. But she didn't leave. "I'm sorry," she whispered finally. "I froze out there. When I saw them, all I could think about was Daniel. The night he died. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. If you hadn't stepped in front of me, but I did," James said softly. "And I'd do it again." Catherine looked at him, really looked at him for maybe the first time since they'd met. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you risk your life for me? This marriage, it's just an arrangement. You don't owe me anything. You don't even know me." James thought about that for a moment. "Maybe I want to," he said. "Know you, I mean." Catherine's breath caught. Fresh tears started rolling down her face. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't let anyone close again. When Daniel died, it nearly killed me too. I built these walls to protect myself. If I let them down, if I let myself care about someone again and then I lose them." She shook her head. "I can't survive that pain again. What if you don't lose them?" James asked gently. "What if you spend the rest of your life alone and miserable, protecting yourself from a pain that might never come?" Catherine stood up abruptly. "You don't understand," she said. "Everyone I've ever cared about has left me or died. My parents, my husband, even the men who tried to court me afterward. People say I'm cursed, and maybe they're right. Maybe I am." "You're not cursed," James said. "You're just afraid." Catherine looked at him with those storm-gray eyes, and for a moment James thought she might actually let her walls down. But then she shook her head and walked to the door. The days following the shooting were different. James couldn't do much work with his injured shoulder, so he spent most of his time resting in his room or sitting on the porch, and Catherine surprisingly stayed close by. At first she pretended it was just about checking on his wound. She'd come in twice a day to change the bandages, her hands gentle but her face blank as always. She'd ask if he was in pain, if he needed anything, then leave without waiting for much of an answer. But James noticed she was coming by more often than necessary. Sometimes she'd just sit in the chair by his bed for a few minutes, not saying anything, just being there. One morning, about 4 days after the incident, James woke up to find Catherine already in his room. She was sitting in the chair, watching him sleep. When she realized he was awake, she looked embarrassed. "Sorry," she said quickly. "I was just checking that you were breathing okay. Sometimes with injuries like that, fever can set in." James didn't point out that checking if someone is breathing doesn't require sitting and watching them for who knows how long. "No fever," he said. "I'm feeling better, actually." Catherine nodded and stood to leave, but James spoke before she could go. "Do you want to talk for a bit? I mean, you're already here and I'm pretty bored just lying around all day." She hesitated, standing there like she was trying to decide whether to run away or stay. Finally, she sat back down. "What do you want to talk about?" "Anything," James said. "Tell me about the ranch. How long have you lived here?" Catherine was quiet for a moment. 10 years, she said finally. "Daniel and I bought it together when we got married. It was smaller then, just the house and a few fields. We built it up together year by year." Her voice softened when she talked about Daniel, and James could hear the love that was still there. "He must have been a good man," James said. "He was the best man I ever knew," Catherine said. "He was kind and funny, and he made me laugh every single day. We had plans, you know. We were going to build this place into the biggest ranch in the county. We wanted children someday, a whole house full of them." She paused, her eyes distant. "And then one night all of it was just gone." "I'm sorry," James said. And he meant it. After he died, everyone expected me to sell the ranch and move back east where my family was from. But I couldn't. This place was ours. Selling it would have been like erasing him completely. So I stayed, even though it meant being alone. "You don't have to be alone," James said quietly. Catherine looked at him sharply. "Don't," she said. "Don't start thinking this is something it's not. You saved my life and I'm grateful. But this arrangement we have, it's still just business." But even as she said it, her voice didn't sound as convincing as it once had. And she didn't leave. She stayed in that chair and somehow they kept talking. James told her about growing up on his family's farm, about his father and mother, about the simple life he'd lived before all this happened. Catherine listened, really listened, asking questions sometimes. Over the next week, these conversations became routine. Catherine would come to check on James's wound, and then she'd sit and talk for a while. At first, the talks were short, maybe 10 or 15 minutes, but they got longer each day. Soon they were spending an hour together, sometimes more. James learned things about Catherine he never would have guessed. She loved reading but hadn't picked up a book in years. She used to play piano, and there was actually a piano in the house, covered with a dusty sheet in one of the closed-off rooms. She had a sweet tooth and loved chocolate, but she never bought any because it seemed wasteful to buy treats just for herself. And Catherine learned about James, too. She learned that he'd always wanted to see the ocean but had never left their county. She learned that he was afraid of heights but tried not to show it. She learned that he'd agreed to marry her not just to save the farm, but because he couldn't stand the thought of his mother losing everything. "You're a good son," Catherine said one day. "I'm an obedient son," James corrected, with a small smile. "There's a difference." "No," Catherine said firmly. "You're good. Most men would have run away rather than marry a stranger, especially a stranger with my reputation." "Your reputation is just stories," James said. "I know that now." "But you didn't know it then," Catherine pointed out. "You must have been terrified." James laughed a little. "I was. That first night I barely slept. I kept waiting for you to come through the door and poison me or something." Catherine looked horrified. "You really thought I'd do that?" "I didn't know what to think," James admitted. "But I don't think that anymore. Now I just see a woman who's been hurt and is trying to protect herself." Something in Catherine's expression softened. They sat in silence for a moment, and then she did something surprising. She reached out and took his hand. Not to check his pulse or examine his injury, but just to hold it. Her hand was warm and slightly rough from work. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for not being afraid of me anymore." After 2 weeks, James's shoulder had healed enough that he could start doing light work again. He expected things to go back to how they were before, with Catherine working all day and keeping her distance. But they didn't. Catherine started working near him, close enough that they could talk while they worked. The silence at dinner started to break too. They discussed the ranch, the weather, small things at first, then bigger things. One evening after dinner, James found Catherine in the study looking at that photograph he'd seen weeks ago. She didn't hide it when he came in this time. "This was taken a month before he died," she said, touching the glass over Daniel's face. "We just found out the ranch was finally making a profit. We were so happy that day." James stood beside her, looking at the young, smiling Catherine in the photo. "You should smile like that again," he said. "I don't know if I remember how," Catherine said sadly. "Sure you do," James said. "It's like riding a horse. You never really forget." Catherine looked at him, and the corner of her mouth twitched just slightly. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close. It was something. As the weeks passed, the changes became more obvious. Catherine started leaving her bedroom door open sometimes. She started eating more at dinner, actually finishing her plate. The house seemed a little less dark, a little less cold. She even opened some curtains, letting natural light flood into rooms that had been dim for years. One morning, James heard something he hadn't heard since arriving at the ranch: music. He followed the sound to the closed-off room with the piano. The door was open now, and Catherine was sitting at the piano playing. Her fingers moved over the keys, and the melody that filled the house was beautiful but sad. James stood in the doorway, not wanting to interrupt. Catherine must have sensed him there because she stopped playing and turned around. "I haven't played in 7 years, she said. "I'm rusty." "It sounded beautiful to me," James said honestly. "Daniel loved when I played," Catherine said, looking at the piano keys. "After he died, I couldn't stand to hear music. It hurt too much. But this morning I woke up and thought, maybe it's time to stop running from things that hurt, because avoiding the pain also means avoiding everything good." She looked up at James then, and there was something different in her eyes, something warm. "You did that," she said. "You made me remember that hiding from pain isn't the same as healing from it." James walked into the room and sat beside her on the piano bench. "Play something happy," he said. "Something that makes you smile." "I told you. I don't remember how to smile. Then I guess I'll have to help you remember." Catherine looked at him, really looked at him, and James saw the walls crack a little more. She turned back to the piano and started playing a livelier tune. It was cheerful and bright, and as her fingers danced over the keys, James saw it happen. A real, genuine smile spread across Catherine's face. It started small, just a curve of her lips, then grew until she was actually smiling. It transformed her completely, making her look younger and lighter. "There it is," James said softly. "I knew you remembered." Catherine kept playing, and she kept smiling. And when the song ended, she turned to James, and her smile didn't fade. "Thank you," she said, "for everything, for staying, for being patient, for being kind when I didn't deserve it." "You deserve kindness," James said. "You've always deserved it." They sat there on the piano bench, close enough that their shoulders touched. Neither of them moved away. And in that moment, something shifted between them again. This wasn't just about an arrangement anymore. This wasn't just about gratitude or friendship. This was something deeper, something neither of them had been looking for, but both of them were starting to feel. "James," Catherine said quietly, "I'm scared." "Of what?" "Of this, of whatever this is between us. Of caring about someone again. Of opening my heart and having it broken again." James took her hand the same way she'd taken his weeks ago. "I'm scared too," he admitted. "I never expected any of this. I thought I'd live here like a ghost, just keeping my distance and doing my job. But now I can't imagine not talking to you every day. I can't imagine not seeing you smile." Catherine's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't sad tears this time. "What are we doing?" she whispered. "I don't know," James said honestly. "But maybe we don't have to figure it all out right now. Maybe we can just take it one day at a time." News traveled fast in a small town, and the story of the Rustler attack spread like wildfire. Within days, everyone in 3 counties knew that James Miller had taken a bullet protecting his wife. The story got bigger and more dramatic with each retelling. Some versions had James fighting off a dozen rustlers single-handedly. Others claimed Catherine had saved James's life with her expert marksmanship. The truth was somewhere in between, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that people were talking. The first sign that things were changing came when James went into town for supplies 2 weeks after the incident. Usually, when he showed up at the general store, people would whisper and stare. Some would make excuses to leave. Others would just ignore him, like being married to Catherine made him invisible too. But this time was different. The storekeeper, a gruff old man named Walter, actually smiled when James walked in. "Heard what happened out at your place," Walter said. "That took guts, son. Standing up to rustlers like that." James was so surprised he almost didn't know what to say. Just did what needed doing, he managed. "Well, it's good that Catherine's got someone looking out for her," Walter said. "She's been alone out there too long. Maybe having you around will be good for her." As James shopped, other people came up to him. A woman named Betty, who owned the bakery, gave him a loaf of fresh bread. "For your recovery," she said. "And tell Catherine I said hello. We used to be friendly, before everything." A farmer named Jack clapped James on his good shoulder. "You're all right, Miller. Takes a real man to face down rustlers. Your wife's lucky to have you." The attention made James uncomfortable. He wasn't a hero. He just reacted without thinking. But as he loaded his supplies into the wagon, he realized something important. People weren't just talking about him. They were talking about Catherine differently too. Some of them were starting to question the old stories, wondering if maybe they'd been wrong about her all along, but not everyone was pleased with this change. Robert Thornton was in town that day, and he watched James with cold, calculating eyes. When James was leaving, Robert stopped him on the street. Well, Robert said. "If it isn't the hero of Silver Creek, how's married life treating you, boy?" "Just fine," James said carefully. He didn't trust Robert, and he never would. "Really?" Robert raised an eyebrow. "Living with the Black Widow doesn't bother you? You're not worried you might be her next victim?" "Catherine's not a danger to anyone," James said firmly. "Those are just stories." Robert's smile faded. "Be careful, Miller. You're young and naive. That woman has fooled better men than you. Mark my words, you'll end up just like all the others." James climbed onto his wagon without responding. But as he rode away, he could feel Robert's eyes on his back, and he felt uneasy. Robert had arranged this marriage expecting it to fail. Now that it wasn't failing, would he try to interfere? Back at the ranch, James told Catherine about his trip to town. She was surprised to hear that people had been friendly. They were probably just being polite, she said. But James could see a flicker of hope in her eyes. "No, it was more than that," James insisted. "Betty gave us bread. Jack called you my wife like it was a normal thing. People are changing their minds about you, Catherine." "People don't change their minds that easily," Catherine said. "I've been the town monster for 7 years. One story about rustlers isn't going to fix that." But James was right. Over the next few weeks, more changes came. A few brave souls even rode out to the ranch to visit. Betty came by with another loaf of bread and stayed for tea. She and Catherine talked for over an hour, catching up on years of lost friendship. When Betty left, Catherine had tears in her eyes, but they were happy tears. "I forgot what it was like," she said to James. "To have a friend." Not everyone was ready to forgive and forget, though. Some people in town still held on to the old stories. They insisted Catherine was dangerous and that James was either under some kind of spell or just too stupid to see the truth. And Robert Thornton was the loudest voice among them. Robert started spreading new rumors. He told anyone who would listen that Catherine had shot James herself during an argument. He claimed she was planning to steal the Miller family farm. He even suggested that James was being held prisoner on the ranch, forced to stay against his will. At first, people dismissed these stories as nonsense. But Robert was rich and influential. He owned the bank. He had connections with the sheriff and the mayor. And he was persistent. Slowly, some people started listening to him. The situation came to a head one Saturday afternoon. James and Catherine had gone into town together, something they'd started doing recently. They were at the general store when Sheriff Hayes walked in with two deputies. "Catherine Blackwood," the sheriff said formally. "I need you to come with me to the station. There are some questions that need answering." Catherine went pale. "Questions about what?" "About the shooting incident at your ranch," Sheriff Hayes said. "We've received information that suggests things might not have happened the way you reported." "What are you talking about?" James stepped forward. "I was there. I know exactly what happened. That's why we need to talk to both of you," the sheriff said, separately. People in the store had stopped shopping and were watching the scene unfold. James could see some of them whispering to each other, and his heart sank. This was Robert's doing. He was trying to turn the town against Catherine again. At the sheriff's office, James was put in one room while Catherine was taken to another. A deputy stayed with him, and then Robert Thornton walked in. James felt his anger rise. "What are you doing here?" James demanded. "I'm a concerned citizen," Robert said smoothly. "I arranged this marriage to help your family, and I want to make sure you're safe. Some people in town are worried about you, James. They think Catherine might have shot you and then blamed it on rustlers." "That's insane," James said. "I was there. Rustlers shot me when I stepped in front of Catherine. She saved my life by shooting back at them. Or maybe," Robert suggested, "she shot you first and then fired more shots to make it look like there had been a fight. The ranch hands didn't actually see what happened, did they? They just heard shots and came running. They found you already shot and Catherine holding a gun." "She was holding a gun because she was defending us," James said, his voice rising. "Why are you doing this?" "What do you want?" Robert leaned forward. "I want you to think about your situation, boy. You're married to a woman with a dangerous reputation. You've been shot. Your family farm was in debt to me, and now Catherine owns it through your marriage. Don't you think that's convenient for her?" "The farm isn't worth anything to her," James protested. "She has her own ranch, much bigger and more valuable than ours. For now," Robert said. "But what if she loses her ranch? What if, say, I decided to call in some debts she owes? Then your little family farm would be quite useful to her, wouldn't it?" James felt cold. "Catherine doesn't owe you anything, doesn't she?" Robert pulled out some papers. "Her first husband, Daniel, took out a loan from me years ago. After he died, that debt passed to Catherine. She's been making payments, but she's behind. Way behind. If I demanded full payment right now, she couldn't pay it. I'd have to foreclose on her ranch." "You set this up," James said slowly, realization dawning. "You arranged for me to marry Catherine because you wanted her land. You thought the marriage would fail, and then you could swoop in and take everything." Robert smiled. "Smart boy. But things didn't work out the way I planned, did they? You two actually seem to get along, so now I need a different approach. If I can convince people that Catherine is dangerous, that she tried to kill you, then the marriage can be annulled. You'll get your family farm back. Catherine will lose everything, and I'll purchase her land at auction." "That's not going to happen," James said firmly. "I'm not going to lie about what happened that night." "You don't have to lie," Robert said. "I've already planted enough doubt. The sheriff is talking to Catherine right now, and I made sure he's asking her some very pointed questions. She's already nervous and scared. People like that say things they shouldn't. They contradict themselves. They look guilty even when they're innocent." James tried to stand up, but the deputy stopped him. "Let me see her," James demanded. "Let me talk to Catherine." "All in good time," Robert said, standing up. "Just think about what I've said, James. Think about whether you really want to tie yourself to a woman everyone fears. Think about whether you want to risk ending up like her first husband." After Robert left, James sat alone in the room for what felt like hours. His mind was racing. Robert had this all planned out. He'd been manipulating everything from the start. The debt, the marriage, the rumors, all of it was designed to get Catherine's land. Finally, Sheriff Hayes came in. He looked tired and frustrated. "You can go," he said. "Both of you. There's no evidence of any wrongdoing." "Where's Catherine?" James asked immediately. "She's waiting outside." James rushed out of the room and found Catherine sitting on a bench in the hallway. Her face was pale and her hands were shaking. When she saw him, she stood up quickly. "James, I'm sorry. They were asking me all these questions and I got confused and I think I made things worse." "It's okay," James said, taking her hands. They were ice cold. "Let's just go home." The ride back to the ranch was silent. Catherine stared straight ahead, her face like stone again. All the progress they'd made over the past week seemed to crumble in the face of Robert's accusations and the town's judgment. James could see her rebuilding those walls brick by brick, trying to protect herself from the pain. When they got home, Catherine went straight to her room and closed the door. James stood in the hallway, feeling helpless. He wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay, but how could he when he didn't know if that was true? That night, James couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about everything Robert had said. About the debts, the manipulation, the careful planning. Robert had orchestrated all of this, and somehow, he'd managed to make Catherine look guilty in the process. There had to be something they could do, some way to prove what Robert was really up to. Around midnight, James got up and went to his father's old trunk. After his father died, James had brought a few of his personal belongings to the ranch, things his mother thought he might want someday. He'd never looked through them before. It had been too painful. But now he opened the trunk and started searching through papers. There were old letters, receipts, documents about the farm. James wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he had a feeling there might be something here, some clue about how his father had gotten into debt to Robert in the first place. He was about to give up when he found a folder hidden at the bottom of the trunk. Inside were more papers, including the original loan document Robert had shown them. James looked at it carefully. $50,000 due within 5 years. The signature at the bottom was his father's, but something didn't look right. James held the paper up to the lamplight and squinted at it. The signature looked like his father's handwriting, but something about it was off. The loops were too perfect, too careful. His father's actual handwriting was messier, more rushed. James's heart started beating faster. He dug through more papers and found an old letter his father had written to his mother years ago. He compared the two signatures. They were similar but definitely different. Someone had forged his father's signature on the loan document. James kept searching and found more papers. There was a letter from Robert to his father, dated 8 years ago. In it, Robert mentioned a business opportunity and asked James's father to invest. But there was no mention of a loan. James's father had responded with a polite refusal, saying he didn't have money to invest. The more James read, the more he understood. His father had never taken out a loan from Robert. Robert had forged the documents after his father died, knowing that a grieving widow and young son wouldn't think to question them. It was fraud, plain and simple, but would anyone believe him? Robert was rich and powerful. James was just a young man with no influence. He needed more evidence. He needed proof that Robert had done this before, that this was part of a pattern. And then James remembered something. Robert had mentioned that Catherine's first husband, Daniel, had also taken out a loan. What if that loan was fake too? What if Robert had been using forged documents to steal land for years? James waited until morning, then went to find Catherine. She was already up working in the barn. Her eyes were red like she'd been crying, but her face was set in that cold, determined expression he knew so well. "Catherine," James said, "I need to ask you something. The loan Robert said Daniel took out, do you have the original documents?" Catherine looked confused. "Yes, they're in Daniel's old desk." "Why? Can I see them?" "Please, it's important." Catherine led him to the study and pulled out a folder from the desk. Inside was a loan document, similar to the one James had found in his father's trunk. $50,000 due within 10 years. Daniel's signature was at the bottom. "Did Daniel ever mention this loan to you?" James asked. Catherine frowned. "No, never. Robert showed up about a year after Daniel died and presented this document. I was shocked because Daniel and I talked about everything, especially money. But I thought maybe he'd kept it secret because he didn't want me to worry." "Look at the signature," James said, showing her the letter his father had written. "Compare it to my father's real handwriting. The loan signature is forged. I think Robert did the same thing to Daniel. He waited until Daniel was dead, then created fake loan documents." Catherine's eyes went wide. She grabbed another paper from the desk, a letter Daniel had written to her years ago. They compared the signatures. Just like with James's father, the loan signature was similar but not quite right. The differences were subtle, but they were there. "He's been doing this to people," Catherine whispered. "How many others? How many families has he destroyed with fake debts?" "I don't know," James said. "But we need to prove it. We need to find more evidence and take it to someone who can help us." They spent the next 3 days searching through everything. Catherine had kept all of Daniel's papers, and they went through every single one. They found more inconsistencies, bills that had supposedly been paid to Robert's bank, but Daniel's financial records showed the money had gone elsewhere. Dates that didn't match up, small details that, when put together, painted a clear picture of fraud. James also rode into town and talked to some of the older residents quietly. He learned that Robert had done this to at least 3 other families over the years. Each time a man had died unexpectedly, and then Robert had showed up with loan documents the family had never heard of. Each time the family had lost their land to Robert, but none of these families had fought back. They'd been too grief-stricken, too overwhelmed, or too scared. They'd just accepted Robert's claims and walked away. "We're not going to do that," James told Catherine. "We're going to fight." The problem was Sheriff Hayes. He was close friends with Robert and wouldn't listen to accusations against him. They needed to go over his head to someone with more authority who wasn't in Robert's pocket. Frank, the old ranch hand, suggested they contact the federal marshal. "The marshal handles fraud cases, especially when they involve forged documents and land theft," Frank said. "And he don't answer to local politics. He answers to the federal government." James and Catherine rode to the next town over, where the marshal's office was located. The marshal, a stern man named Henry Walsh, listened to their story. At first he seemed skeptical, but when they showed him the documents, the comparisons of signatures, and the pattern of Robert's behavior over the years, his expression changed. "This is serious," Marshal Walsh said. "If what you're saying is true, Robert Thornton has been committing fraud for years. But I need more than just your word and some signature comparisons. I need witnesses, more documentation, and I need to investigate without tipping Thornton off." "What can we do to help?" James asked. "Go back home and act normal," the marshal said. "Don't let Thornton know you suspect anything. Meanwhile, I'll start gathering evidence. I'll talk to the other families, get handwriting experts to examine the signatures, and look into Thornton's bank records. This will take time, maybe a few weeks." "Can you two hold on that long?" James and Catherine looked at each other and nodded. "We can hold on," Catherine said. The next few weeks were the hardest of James's life. They had to pretend everything was normal while the whole town whispered about them. Robert kept spreading his rumors, and more people started believing them. Some of the ranch hands quit, too afraid of Catherine's reputation to keep working there. Supplies got harder to buy because some store owners refused to serve them. Through it all, James and Catherine held on to each other. At night, they'd sit together in the study, talking about their fears and hopes. Catherine's walls had come down completely now. She wasn't hiding anymore, at least not from James. "Whatever happens," Catherine said one night, "I'm glad you're here. I'm glad I'm not facing this alone." "You'll never be alone again," James promised. "Not as long as I'm breathing." Catherine took his hand and squeezed it tight. "I think I'm falling in love with you," she whispered. "I didn't think I could ever feel this way again. I didn't think my heart could heal. But you've shown me that it can." James felt his own heart swell. "I love you too," he said. "I think I started falling for you the day I saw you feeding that stray dog. I saw the real you, the woman behind all the walls. And that's who I fell in love with." They sat there holding hands, finding strength in each other while the world seemed to turn against them. Finally, after 3 long weeks, Marshal Walsh came to the ranch. He wasn't alone. He brought 2 deputies and a federal prosecutor with him. They all looked very serious. "We've completed our investigation," Marshal Walsh said, "and you were right. Robert Thornton has been forging loan documents for at least 8 years. We found evidence of fraud involving 12 different families. He's been systematically stealing land through fake debts." "Can you prove it?" Catherine asked, almost afraid to hope. "Yes," the prosecutor said. "We have handwriting experts who analyze the signatures. We have testimony from the other victims. We have bank records showing that the supposed loan payments were never actually made. And we found something else. One of Thornton's former employees came forward. He admitted that Thornton paid him to forge the documents and keep quiet about it." James felt relief wash over him. So what happens now? 6 months had passed since Robert Thornton's arrest, and life at the ranch had transformed completely. The change wasn't just in the property itself, though that was certainly different. Catherine had opened all the curtains, letting sunlight flood every room. She'd planted flowers around the house, bringing color and life to a place that had been gray for so long. The house that once felt like a tomb now felt warm and welcoming. But the real transformation was in Catherine herself. The woman who used to hide behind cold walls and never smile had become someone completely different. She laughed often now, her face lighting up in ways that made her look years younger. She sang while she worked, played piano every evening, and had reconnected with old friends she'd pushed away years ago. James watched these changes with wonder and joy. Every day he fell more in love with his wife. Not the woman he'd been forced to marry, but the woman she'd become. Or maybe the woman she'd always been underneath the fear and pain. Their relationship had deepened in ways James never expected. They worked side by side during the day, talked for hours in the evening, and fell asleep in each other's arms at night. The separate bedrooms had been abandoned months ago. They were truly husband and wife now, in every sense of the word. The town's attitude toward them had changed dramatically too. Once Robert's crimes came to light, people felt ashamed of how they'd treated Catherine. They realized they'd been cruel and judgmental, believing rumors instead of seeing the truth. Many came to apologize, and Catherine, with her newly opened heart, forgave them all. "Holding on to anger only hurts me," she told James one night. "I wasted 7 years being angry and scared. I don't want to waste any more time on negative feelings." The ranch was thriving now. With the false debts cleared, Catherine had money to make improvements. They hired more workers, expanded the cattle operation, and even started breeding horses. The ranch that had seemed lonely and sad was now bustling with activity and life. But the biggest shock to everyone came when Catherine announced she wanted to help the other families Robert had hurt. She used her own money to compensate some of them for what they'd lost. For families who'd lost their homes, she helped them buy new properties. For those who'd been struggling, she offered jobs on her ranch or helped them start new businesses. "I have more than I need," Catherine explained to a surprised James. "And these people suffered just like we did. If I can help them rebuild their lives, why wouldn't I?" The community was stunned by her generosity. The woman they'd called the Black Widow, the woman they'd feared and avoided, was now helping everyone. People started seeing Catherine not as someone to fear, but as someone to admire and respect. Betty from the bakery started a weekly gathering at Catherine's ranch. Women from town would come by for tea and conversation. At first only a few brave souls showed up, but soon the gatherings grew larger. Catherine's home became a place where people felt welcome and comfortable. "You've become the heart of this community," Betty told Catherine one afternoon. "It's amazing how things have changed." James's mother came to visit often now, delighted to see her son so happy. "I felt so guilty about pushing you into this marriage," and she confessed to both of them one day. "I thought I was ruining your life. You gave me the best thing that ever happened to me," James said, pulling Catherine close. "You gave me her." The autumn harvest festival came around, and the town decided to hold it on Catherine's ranch. This was unprecedented. The festival had always been held in the town square, but so many people had been coming to visit the ranch that it seemed like the natural choice. The day of the festival was beautiful. The weather was perfect, cool and crisp with clear blue skies. People came from all over the county, bringing food and music and games. The ranch was filled with laughter and celebration. Catherine and James stood together watching the festivities, amazed at how their lives had changed. Just a year ago, Catherine had been alone and feared. James had been a desperate young man forced into an unwanted marriage. Now they were surrounded by friends, part of a community that had learned to see past rumors and prejudice. "I have something I want to do," Catherine said suddenly. She climbed up onto the porch railing so everyone could see her. "Excuse me," she called out. "Can I have everyone's attention?" The crowd quieted down, turning to look at her. Catherine took a deep breath, and James saw her hand tremble slightly. She was nervous, but she was doing this anyway. That was the Catherine he knew now, brave even when scared. "Most of you know my story," Catherine began. "You know about the rumors that followed me for years. You know about the wedding that brought James and me together. What you might not know is that when James and I got married, it wasn't by choice. It was an arrangement made out of desperation and manipulation." The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. "I accepted that arrangement because I'd given up on ever being happy again," Catherine continued. "I'd built walls around my heart so thick that I couldn't feel anything anymore. I'd convinced myself that being alone was safer than ever loving someone again. But then this stubborn, kind, brave man came into my life and refused to let me hide." She looked down at James, and her eyes were shining with tears. "James saved my life twice. Once when he stepped in front of a bullet for me. And once when he showed me I could trust again, love again, live again. He saw past all the rumors and fear and found the real me buried underneath. And he loved that person, even when I didn't love myself. James felt his own eyes getting wet. He hadn't known Catherine was going to do this. So today, Catherine said, in front of all of you, I want to do something I should have done months ago. She climbed down from the railing and walked over to James. She took both his hands in hers and looked into his eyes. James Miller, we got married once because we had no choice. Today I want to marry you again because it's the choice I want to make. Will you marry me again? For real this time? The crowd gasped and then erupted in cheers. James laughed, tears running down his face. Yes, he said. 1,000 times yes. They kissed while everyone applauded and cheered. And right there in the middle of the festival with the whole community watching, the minister who'd performed their first wedding came forward to do it again. This ceremony was nothing like the first one. There was no cold silence, no whispers of fear. There was joy and celebration and love. When the minister asked if they took each other as husband and wife, both of them said I do with absolute certainty. No more I accept this arrangement. This was real. This was choice. You may kiss your bride, the minister said, smiling broadly. And James did. He kissed Catherine like she was the most precious thing in the world, because to him she was. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were crying and laughing at the same time. The celebration that followed was unlike anything the town had ever seen. People danced and sang and celebrated not just a wedding, but a love story that had overcome incredible odds. The young man who'd been forced to marry the most feared woman in the county had found true love. And the Black Widow of Silver Creek had learned to live again. As the sun set and the festival wound down, James and Catherine found a quiet moment alone. They sat on the porch steps watching the last guests depart, waving goodbye. Can you believe this? Catherine asked, leaning her head on James's shoulder. A year ago I was convinced I'd spend the rest of my life alone. I thought I was cursed, that everyone I cared about would leave or die. I was so sure I'd lost my chance at happiness. And now, James asked, kissing the top of her head. Now I know I was wrong about everything, Catherine said. I wasn't cursed. I was just hurt and scared. And I didn't lose my chance at happiness. It just came in a way I never expected. Wrapped up in a forced marriage and a debt that didn't even exist. Robert thought he was destroying us when he arranged our marriage, James said. But he actually gave us the greatest gift. He brought us together. You know what the best part is? Catherine said, looking up at him with those storm-gray eyes that James loved so much. People thought they knew my story. They thought they knew what would happen when a young man married the Black Widow. They expected tragedy and death and misery. And instead we shocked them all, Catherine said, smiling. We found love. We found happiness. We found each other. And we proved that sometimes the most unexpected beginnings can lead to the most beautiful endings. They sat there in comfortable silence, watching the stars come out one by one. Frank and the other ranch hands were cleaning up the festival decorations, whistling as they worked. Lights glowed in the windows of the house, warm and welcoming. What do you think people will say about us now? James asked. What story will they tell? Catherine thought about it for a moment. I think they'll say that a young man was forced to marry the most feared woman in 3 counties. And what happened next shocked everyone, because instead of tragedy, they found the greatest love story Silver Creek had ever known. I like that story, James said. Me too, Catherine agreed, because it's our story, and it's true. A few weeks later, Catherine came to James with news that shocked him again, this time in the best possible way. I'm pregnant, she whispered, her eyes shining with joy and wonder.